Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's really fun to be part of this community today and meet a bunch of you. So you might notice my title changed a little bit. Before it was talking just about New Caledonian crows, but I actually have some preliminary results from Western scrub jays and great-tailed grackles on the same experiments. So I'm going to couch this in a more comparative context and share with you stuff that's hot off the press. Well, not even in press, so yeah, it's new. So first I'm going to talk about, the talk will be in two parts. First I'll talk about how birds learn about new resources, and then I'll talk about how they solve novel problems. And the first part about how they learn about new resources is just involving New Caledonian crows, because I haven't done the comparative work on that aspect of the study yet. And the second part is about how they solve novel problems, and that involves the three species, the scrub jays, New Caledonian crows, and great-tailed grackles. So I'll just jump right in to the New Caledonian crow work on the learning experiment. Now this was done in collaboration with the Auckland group who studies New Caledonian crows in New Caledonia. This is Russell Gray, Alex Taylor. This was also in collaboration with Sarah Gelbert, one of their PhD students, and my research assistant, Alexis Breen. So we went to New Caledonia in the summer of 2013, caught wild New Caledonian crows, brought them into aviaries, and did these experiments. And so particularly why the New Caledonian crows are interesting in the sense of learning, how do they learn about novel foraging problems, is, well, I'm going to tell you a bit about their ecology, but part of it has to do with the fact that they live in New Caledonia, which is this country of a couple of islands off the east coast of Australia, about 800 miles off the east coast. So that's Fiji, and here's Australia, so it's really in the middle of the ocean. New Caledonia is the only place where these crows exist, so they're very much an island species. And they do some pretty interesting things. So they make tools and they use tools. And they not only make one kind of tool, they make a few different kinds of tools. So here you can see that this one is making a stick tool, and they make stick tools by snapping off the twigs, and they can make a hook out of it actually as well if they snap it off in the right place. So they make hook stick tools and non-hook stick tools. They also make tools out of this plant called the Pandanus plant, and it's kind of like a palm tree. So the leaf is serrated, and what they do is they cut into the leaf at both ends and they rip it off, and it turns into kind of a stick-like tool that they can put into the holes in logs and dig out grubs. So one of the main uses that they use these tools for is in New Caledonia, they have these massive grubs. They're larvae that are seriously like the size of my two fingers on my hand. I mean, for a crow, that's not that big. This is a gigantic meal that apparently is worth working for, and they do, which seems to be why well, it's what they use the tools for, and why they make them is to dig these larvae out of these holes and get this really nutritious meal. So in terms of the Pandanus tools, they make a few different kinds of Pandanus tools. So there's a wide tool here, a narrow, one that has a step, so it will kind of start to taper towards the end, and a multi-step tool, it has even more steps. So potentially, the multi-step tools are more structurally functional if you're trying to dig out grubs out of deeper holes. Though that hasn't been tested, that's kind of one of the ideas behind why they might use and make different kinds of these Pandanus tools. So the Pandanus tools, in terms of these different shapes, vary across the island. So this is the main island of New Caledonia. And so the Pandanus tools, you can see here the narrow, the wide, and the stepped, and they occur in different regions and overlapping regions on the island. So the wide tool is made at sites in this particular region in the southern end of the island. In an overlapping area and slightly larger, the narrow tool is also made. And on the rest of the island, including these two areas, the stepped tool is made. So there's a big question of why there's this variation in the Pandanus tool manufacture. Why make different kinds, and what's kind of maintaining this tool diversity across the island in this kind of odd pattern? And so one of the explanations could be ecology. Perhaps there's something in the way that the ecology of the island varies such that you would only make the narrow tools in this area or only make the wide tools in that area. But the ecological factors that have been studied so far have not had any bearing on the distribution of the different kinds of Pandanus tools that are made. So the different characteristics that have been studied in terms of ecology are the Pandanus morphology. So perhaps different leaf morphs of the Pandanus plant are more amenable to making certain kinds of Pandanus tools, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The Pandanus tool manufacture across the island, the variation does not overlap with rainfall or altitude. So at least in terms of these factors, now there are more factors that obviously could be studied in terms of ecology, but they haven't yet. But in terms of the factors that have been studied, we're not seeing any kind of correlation with the geographic pattern of tool variation for the Pandanus tool. So another thing that could explain the variation in the Pandanus tool is genetics. And one thing we do know is that the individuals or the families that are closer together on their territories are more closely related. However, the analysis is done at a very broad scale, so we don't know if in this particular area this is a set of families, and then in this area it's a set of different families that are kind of overlapping in terms of their territories. We don't have that level of detail yet, so genetics could still play a role in the variation of Pandanus tools. Now, another hypothesis that has been put forward by Gavin Hunt and Russell Gray is that it could be an example of cumulative technological culture. So what is that, and how might it be working? So in order for cumulative technological culture to evolve, it would need to have a high fidelity of social transmission. So if I'm a crow and I'm an adult and I'm making these Pandanus tools, let's say I make a multi-step tool, and my offspring then learn how to make that same kind of tool, there must be a really high level of copying. They must be able to copy it very precisely to make the distinction between these different tool types and then carry those kind of technological traditions across generations. And if they had this high fidelity social transmission that was carried across generations, you might get a few errors here and there that could induce cumulative change of the tools over time, which could potentially lead to the diversification of these different tool types. If you treated each tool as its kind of own lineage, perhaps it did start with the narrow tool originally, and over time that in some groups evolved into the wide tool and then perhaps into the multi-step tool. This is all hypothetical, but it's an idea of how things could have happened over the course of the New Caledonian Crow time on the island. So one of the things that we're not super clear on is whether crows and how crows socially learn. There have been some studies that show stimulus enhancement or local enhancement. I will explain more about what those are, but it seems like in order for this kind of cumulative technological culture to evolve, they'll need to learn from others how to recreate these tool shapes, and it will be important to see what learning mechanisms they use and whether those learning mechanisms would enable cumulative culture to evolve. So this is what I was doing in New Caledonia with the crows, and that was to see whether they socially learn and how. And so this is an apparatus that I used. It's the same apparatus, but there are two copies of it on the table, and it has a few different ways of finding food. So there's the vertical apparatus where you could swivel the door to the right and poke your bill in and get hard-boiled egg. You could swivel the door to the left and poke your bill through a piece of rubber and get hard-boiled egg out of the same cup. Or you could lift up this flap to access this food cup, or access the same food cup through a hole in the side. So there were 4 different ways of solving it at 2 different loci. And so this was designed in collaboration with Will Hoppett, who has done social learning experiments on meerkats. And so we kind of based the idea on the meerkat experiment to try and to use his modeling to be able to really tease apart what learning mechanisms the crows are using. So the learning mechanisms we were able to get at are whether do the crows just not pay attention to any social information at all and go at the apparatus and solve it as if they had never seen anyone do that, and so just rely on their own personal information to solve the task. Do they use local enhancement? So if they saw a bird touch anywhere on this apparatus, are they more drawn to go to that apparatus than this apparatus? And if they saw a bird touch, particularly this stimulus, let's say, are they more drawn to going to that option first and try and solve that option before solving the other options on either apparatus? So it would be drawn to the stimulus regardless of where it was. Or do they use some kind of emulation or imitation? And this is where you're copying the movements of another, either a complete sequence as an imitation or parts of a sequence as an emulation. And these are the two mechanisms that are thought to be used if cumulative culture was to evolve. So you'd have to copy the motor patterns to be able to make the same tools that you're seeing others make. That's the predominant hypothesis so far. So the methods for the study involved studying 3 groups, and this is in an aviary, wild-caught birds. So Blue's group was consisted of 4 birds, and he was trained on how to solve the apparatus through the side hole. White-Orange's group was another group, and she was trained on how to push the flap to the right and access the egg through the hole. And then there was a control group that had no trained demonstrator, so we wanted to see what they did just if they were needing to solve it by themselves. And each group got 8 sessions of up to 45 minutes per session. Now the modeling part is what Will did, so I'll cover what I know of it. So he used a Cox proportional hazards model to look at, which was sensitive to the order and the latency of events at each option. So the order in which birds saw individuals approach a particular option, and the order in which those individuals themselves then approached and tried to solve the different options at either apparatus was recorded. He modeled the rate at which an individual first attempted a method as a function of predictor variables like age and sex and dominance rank, and that the model accounted for previous attempts of the observations of others. So even if one of the birds that was not a demonstrator was solving the task, that counted as a demonstrator action because the other birds are able to observe another bird attempt or solve the how to solve that option. To give you an idea of what it looks like, I'll show you a video. So first, I trained Blue to, actually I originally trained him how to solve the vertical flap. So this is his testing period where he's got to do it correctly and only solve that option before I'll let him demonstrate it to the group. He liked to stand on top and solve it, even though you could solve it from the ground, but sometimes he would even hang off to the side. It was an interesting variation that he chose. Now I release him to the group, and now this is Orange. He's attempting Blue's technique for solving the vertical flap. And now Green, who's Blue's mate, she's going to do the same thing, but now she uses a stick. They just love sticks, and they'll carry them around and try and use them on everything. So it's not functional in this case, using a stick to get egg out, but she does it anyway. So Orange discovers how to open the horizontal flap, which was something that was really difficult for them to do, and only a few birds did it. Because it's falling on their head, and it's pretty scary. And just to show you, here's Blue solving the horizontal side, so now you'll have seen almost all of the options. So that's it, yeah.
Can I just ask a question? So
yeah.
Is the individual who knows how to do it the one that's making the noise and displaying?
So okay, in this group, there were 2 monogamous pairs. So the ones that are begging are the females, and so in particular, Orange's mate was begging to him. So she'll go around, and she can obviously feed herself just fine, but she would just beg from him the entire time. And the flap would be open, and she could reach her head in, but she just wanted him to feed her, and he never did. But It was begging season. Oh my gosh. But it was the females begging from the males. Yeah. From their partners.
All four loci are baited during all of this?
Yes. Unless, so for instance, with the horizontal flap, when they get that up, they could often empty that container, but it wouldn't be until at least like 15, 20 minutes into the experiment. So there were a lot of observations where it was always baited. Yeah. So what did we find out? We found that they actually use a combination of stimulus enhancement and asocial learning to solve this task. So specifically, they are using, they see a demonstrator either succeed or even attempt without getting the food. That also has quite an influence on them. They succeed or attempt at a particular option, which increases the observer's likelihood of attempting that option before other options. So that was the stimulus enhancement. So the demonstrator draws the observer's attention to the particular stimulus. And then after that observer makes first contact with that option on that apparatus, it actually has no bearing, whatever else they see about another bird solving that option after that. They take no social information into account after that. It's that they try to solve it and then they focus and they use it completely their own personal information on solving the actual task. So other observations, so let's say a bird approaches the vertical flap and it has seen someone solve the vertical flap, great, so it goes up and starts to solve it. Even if it takes a break and sees others solving this task, the vertical flap, it's not going to decrease the latency with which it's going to actually successfully solve the vertical flap. So successfully means that getting the food, and attempting means that they tried it but they didn't get the food. So that latency does not decrease with further observations of others. So it's really just that they're cued into the particular stimulus, what to attend to on the apparatus. That's the social part. So we didn't find imitation or emulation, and how can then the cumulative technological culture hypothesis work out if they're not paying attention to the motor actions of the others that are solving this task, as you think that they would need to if they were going to make these really detailedly different types of Pandanus tools. So first I'll kind of take you through how our experiment seems to really match what's going on in the wild, and then I'll have a hypothesis for how they might be able to do this. So the development of behavior side is what we know about them in the wild, and the learning mechanisms are what we found about them in the aviary. So in the wild, their parents, the juveniles are always with their parents. They're with their parents for a couple of years, so they're with them for quite a long time. And the parents draw attention to the tool that they're using. So a juvenile that's in the vicinity of one of their parents that's using a tool, the juvenile will often go and be drawn to that tool. Also, they're not actually seeing their parents make a lot of Pandanus tools at the Pandanus plant. That doesn't seem to occur too often, but occasionally they do see this. So this matches up with our stimulus enhancement finding of the parents showing juveniles, not showing, but the juvenile's attention being drawn to what to attend to. And in our experiment, the stimulus enhancement was that effect. What do they attend to? And in this case, anyone can draw their attention to an option, not just their parents. So it's not a vertical transmission from an older generation to a younger generation, but learning across the board. In the wild, the juveniles, so when it sees a parent using a tool, often the adult will leave the tool in the hole, and the juvenile will come up and try and use the tool and dig out the larvae. They're really bad at it at first. It takes them a really long time, like several months, to actually proficiently use these tools. So they're practicing with their own tools, and they're also practicing with their parents' tools. So they're getting a lot of practice in this at this point, which could match onto our trial and error learning, where where they're using personal information about how to solve the problem, not social information. So their parents draw their attention to the tool, they go and they try and use the tool, and it takes them a really long time. It seems like there's a lot of trial and error learning involved in that. Now, this is the part where we start to need to make hypotheses for how it's working. So the study that found the Pandanus variation, tool type variation across the island was looking at the Pandanus plants because they leave cutouts. When the crow rips the tool off, it leaves a cutout of the shape of the tool on the plant. So what they did, Gavin Hunt went to the field and was looking at the Pandanus plant leaves and recording what shaped tool was cut out at this particular plant. And those were the sites that were all around the island. So what he found was that there were mostly at the same sites, there were really only one tool type made at each site. So that's where the potentially cumulative culture is coming in. How do we explain that in terms of our results? Well, how could they make the same shape of tool without copying motor patterns of how to make this tool? Well, what we're thinking is that perhaps the fact that they are in an environment with mostly their parents, there's not a whole lot of interaction with other groups. And so if their parents make a particular kind of tool, that's a particular shape, and that's what they're used to practicing with and seeing in the fields, and they are doing this for several months as they're with their parents, then perhaps they're kind of imprinting on a particular tool shape. So a Pandanus tool in their mind perhaps is this, and so when they go to the plant themselves and try and make their own tool, perhaps that's why they make a particular shape. So it's some kind of associative learning between shape and tool making. So that's how we're thinking that it could still, an explanation for how it could potentially be occurring. There are a lot of things that still need to be explored in terms of what happens in the wild, what happens specifically regarding tool making and tool use. It's pretty difficult to get that data since in the wild they're pretty much living in the forest canopies, and it's extremely difficult to study them. So they're trying to balance kind of lab studies with wild studies at the moment to try and get at this. But it seems like at least we were able to identify some learning mechanisms they use and propose a potential hypothesis for how cumulative technological culture could evolve. So this is the part where we're coming to a close on the learning aspect. So how do New Caledonian crows learn about new resources? Well, they use stimulus enhancement to cue into what to interact with, and then they learn by trial and error. Now with this particular task, they were only able to learn by trial and error. They could not use any kind of previous information about the world to solve this problem because it was an apparatus that I built and they had to explore to figure out how to work. But what if we gave them an kind of apparatus where they could use some kind of prior information about the world if they had it to solve it? So in this case, I'm curious about how birds, and now we're getting into 3 different species that I'll show you in a second, how do they solve novel problems? And in particular, I'm curious about whether they're using some kind of complex cognition to solve these problems. Complex in terms of, is the behavior flexible? Is it attuned to the functional properties of the task at hand? And is there potentially causal cognition involved? And so, well, I'll get into who I'm doing what with in a second. So the species I'm looking at are New Caledonian crows. I did these experiments with them just after I did the social learning experiment. Great-tailed grackles, which is a field site I'm setting up and actually have set up at Santa Barbara at the University of California, and western scrubjays, who I am collaborating with Barney Schlinger, Michelle Rensel, and Bridget Harvey on. So I mentioned complex cognition. I'm curious about whether they might be using complex cognition to solve these novel problems. Well, a few of the reasons to investigate these species are that there are hypotheses that say that brain size indicates complex cognition. So we've got 2 species that have large brains for their body sizes here, the crow and the scrubjay, and the great-tailed grackle has about an average brain size for its body size. So the log of the brain volume is on the y-axis, and the log of the body weight is on the x-axis, and the gray line is the brain size that you would expect for that particular body weight for that species. Each circle is a species. These are all bird species. And so if you're on the line, you've got about an average sized brain for your body size. If you're above the line, then you've got a larger than expected brain size for your body size. And what we see here are that the crows and the scrub jays have quite an enlarged brain size for their body sizes. And all along the top here are the parrot family, the crow family, some hawks, woodpeckers, those kinds of birds. So the interesting thing here relates to the grackles having this smaller brain, and how are they solving these novel problems. And one of the ways they really come into this picture here is looking at behavioral flexibility. So behavioral flexibility also indicates complex cognition because it positively correlates with relative brain size. So in this case, I'm looking at innovation. Innovation as defined by the number of different food types you eat or the number of different ways you find food. And so Sarah Overington and colleagues did this study looking at the diversity of innovations. So diversity of innovations in this case just means that if a species had a lot of different food types that they ate, as well as a lot of different foraging methods that they used to eat food, then they would be they would have a diverse set of innovations. So that's on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the average relative brain volume, and these are residuals. So the interesting thing about the grackles, that's the genus Quiscalis, is that they're the second most innovative genus after Corvus, which is the crow genus, in North America. And they don't have the second largest relative brain size, so it's kind of making them a bit of an outlier in terms of how are they solving their problems, and does brain size play a role in how we assume that you'd need a larger brain to solve more complicated problems. So here you'll see that most of our evidence for the genus Quiscalis comes from the common grackle, because most of the work has been done on that species. The great-tailed grackle is down here with not very many innovations because it hasn't been studied a whole lot, but I could already add a ton to it. So if I publish that, great. But then you've got the crows over here, and really the more innovative species tend to be the larger brained ones. So the thing is that the smaller brain species are not often tested in terms of their complex cognition, and they're usually not tested using the same tests that are used on the corvids and the parrots. So our understanding of how this relationship between complex cognition and relative brain size really kind of maps across the range of brain sizes is kind of unknown. And so I wanted to add a data point to this in terms of an innovative species that has a smaller brain. Now you might notice that the scrub jays are not on this innovation list, and that's because they're a bit more narrow in their foraging methods. So they store food for the future, over winter, and they primarily like acorns. So their food range is kind of more limited, and there aren't really publications on these kind of novel foraging techniques for the scrub jays. So that will be interesting because they have this larger brain, so you'd expect them to have, and we have found, complex cognition in them, but when you give them a kind of novel problem to solve that's more general, are they able to do that? So the scrub jay work is done in collaboration with Barney at the back and his undergrad and postdoc. So they're actually collecting the data, which is great. While I'm doing the grackles, Bridget is in the lab here getting all the data on the scrub jays, which I have to admit, I would not trade places with her because the grackles are so much easier to work with than the scrub jays. Oh my gosh. But I love her for it, so that's great. So this is the part about the general problem-solving skills. The tests that I gave them would kind of get at whether they can exhibit this complex cognition in a novel setting. So do problem-solving skills generalize to a new context, and problem-solving skills are another indicator of complex cognition. So there are a few ways to solve problems. You could observe the variation of information as it varies together. So if you do something here, something happens there, you could associate those two things together by watching others or learning on your own. You could receive a reward after a correct response and learn that that's the correct response. You could have a heritable bias toward a particular option, solving it in a particular way. You could attend to cause and effect relationships. So the preview is we're not able to tease apart all of these, but we are able to rule out at least one of these. So I'll get on to the actual experiment that we did. So we used Aesop's fable of the water and the crow in the pitcher. So in the fable, there's a thirsty crow, and it encounters this pitcher, and it can't reach the water through the lid because the water is so low, so it drops stones in and raises the water level to get the water, and it can drink. Well, it's slightly modified here. So there's a water tube with a floating food reward, and there are different kinds of objects that they can drop down the tube to raise the water level and get the food. Now, the objects differ in their functional properties. Some displace more water than others. So are they attending to the functional properties of these objects by choosing objects that are more functional than objects that are not? So in this case, this is what the crows got. So half of these objects are erasers, and half of them are styrofoam. Styrofoam floats, it's not going to do anything, and the erasers sink, so they should choose erasers in this case. And then over here, this is what I used for the Grackles and the Jays, and I made these objects. So these are the heavy objects, and these are the light objects. And the heavy objects are a steel rod with clay around them, and the light objects are a piece of PVC pipe with some clay on the inside. And so in this case, actually both objects are functional, but the heavy objects are a lot more functional. So I designed it that way because I wanted to do a follow-up experiment, which I'll show you next. So to give you an idea of what it looks like, you can see Tequila, a great-tailed grackle, doing heavy versus light. That's a heavy object. He picks up a light object. And that's another heavy object. A light object. And he gets the food. So that's what heavy versus light looks like in the real world. Now what?
Do they figure that out themselves, or do you have to train them on that in the first place?
We have to train them how to drop stones down tubes in the first place. So we do that with a different apparatus, not a water tube. So they drop a stone down a tube, and it falls onto a platform, which collapses, and food falls out the front of the apparatus. And that takes between 165 trials and 400 trials for a grackle to become proficient at it, so that then we'll transfer them to the water test. And they do transfer to the water test really easily. So either from their first trial, they're cued in, or second trial. So yeah. And then this is not the first time he's seen these objects, but he did get 3 habituation trials to the objects. So a heavy item and a light item on a table with peanuts on top and underneath. So he's like manipulating them and not afraid of, well, we see that he's not afraid of them. And then so he gets 3 times of that, and then he moves on to this. So it's kind of quick. So in terms of what we found, here we go. So the numbers in the boxes are the p-values from binomial tests. So if it's significant, it means that they preferred that particular option above chance levels. So every crow and every grackle so far have preferred to drop the heavy objects rather than the light objects into the tube to raise the water level. And this is even when either object could work for the grackles and the crows, or sorry, grackles and the jays. Now the scrub jays so far, we haven't, now I need to couch this in, the scrub jay sample is still small, so we're in the process of building it, but I just wanted to show you some preliminary results and what we're thinking about it. So far, the scrub jays have not shown a preference for heavy objects. But like I said, both objects function in this case, and so they're getting the food reward from the tube, but they're not going for the more efficient choice in this case. Now, one of the questions here is, all right, well, if every bird in the grackles and crows are choosing the heavy objects, perhaps they just have a bias towards heavy objects. Maybe they're more like stones than the light objects, which are kind of lighter and kind of lopsided. And so perhaps there's some kind of heritable bias going on here. And so I wanted to see if we could rule that out as an explanation. And I gave the grackles and the jays a follow-up experiment. So now we've got the same heavy versus light, except for this is a magnet. And I told you before that the heavy objects have a steel rod in them. Well, the heavy objects will now stick to the magnet and become not functional at all. They won't fall into the water. But the light objects will, and I've raised the water level so that they can reach the food if they were to drop enough light objects in. Now, they also kind of have to inhibit dropping the heavy objects in because it blocks the tube when it's stuck on the magnet, and then they can't reach their head in very far. So it's a little more complicated, but at least we can see if they did have this kind of heritable bias towards the heavy objects, they should continue to prefer heavy. But if they're flexible and paying attention to the functional properties of the apparatus and the task, they should switch their preference to the light objects. Now, what we found was that, let me start with the scrub jays. So the scrub jays in the previous experiment, not the magnet one, the original one, they didn't have a preference for heavy or light. That's fine. They're still getting the food. And so the one scrub jay that we have tested with the follow-up experiment on the heavy versus light with the magnet, she continued to not have a preference. So she wasn't switching to preferring light if she was to get the food from the tube. Now, let me cue you into the two grackles here in the light gray. So they originally preferred heavy in the previous experiment, and now in the magnet experiment, they switched to having no preference. So they didn't switch all the way to light, but they did switch to no preference, which is a bit of a stretch, indicating some amount of flexibility. Batido did not, so he preferred heavy in the previous experiment, and now he still prefers heavy. So in his case, it looked like he was not really paying attention to the functional properties of the task. But the interesting thing here, a side story, is that Margarita and Cerveza, they loved the magnet. They would stick the heavy items to the magnet like crazy. And so their data points are not really indicative of what I was trying to test here, but interesting for potentially future experiments. And I'll show you what that looks like. So they were two females. And so this is her first trial. She sticks the heavy to the magnet, and she's looking slightly puzzled. She's trying to pull it off, looking at it. Sticks another heavy on. So she just kept doing this over and over and over again. So these two females went from preferring heavy previously to really, really preferring heavy in this one. And so it was really interesting to watch. They didn't need much reinforcement for this. They weren't really getting the food from the tube, so I would set a little piece of peanut if they participated on top of the apparatus to get them to come back down and keep participating. The females didn't really need it. They just kept going. It was really funny. So with the heavy versus light, there seems to be some flexibility in terms of them being able to switch their preference. And in a further experiment, we were looking at whether they could discriminate between water volumes. So here we've got two tubes. This has a larger volume than this tube, but the water levels are set to the same level. In a previous experiment with the New Caledonian crows, they were given 12 objects here. And so they could drop the the objects into both tubes, and they had enough objects so that they could be functional in the wide tube. So here the option is you should drop the object into the narrow tube because the object will raise that water level by a much larger amount than in the wide tube. So in that previous experiment, they found that the crows didn't differentiate between the wide and narrow tubes. So in the follow-up experiment that I gave them, we only gave them 4 objects. So now they could only get the food if they dropped 2 or so into the wide tube, the narrow tube. And if they tried to drop them into the wide tube, even if they dropped all 4, I made it so they could never reach the food. So if they need to be efficient with their choices, will they? And this is the setup for the Grackles. So here's Buster, a New Caledonian crow, solving this. I used trial 2 rather than trial 1 because trial 1 is pretty boring. They take a long time to work with it. So that's the wide tube. He dropped one in. And that's the narrow tube. We call it the woodpecker technique. And he got it. So most crows did actually choose the narrow tube. So they preferred to drop significantly more objects into the narrow tube than into the wide tube. So that's 4 out of the 6 birds. 2 of the birds didn't have a preference for which tube to drop objects into. And the 2 Grackles that I've tested so far also don't have a preference in terms of which tube to drop objects into, even though all of them are only getting rewarded from the narrow tube when they choose that tube. So for those crows that did choose the narrow tube, are they able to be flexible in these preferences as well? If the task changes, can they adapt accordingly? So in this follow-up experiment, it's the same thing except for I dropped the water level in the narrow tube to 5 centimeters, so it's way too low for them to ever be able to get. And I raised the water level over here so they could get the food in about if they dropped 2 objects in. So in this case, what we found was that most of the birds that went on to this follow-up experiment were able to switch their preferences to the wide tube. So it does seem to be flexible in that sense as well. There was one bird who didn't attend to the difference. She kept dropping objects into the narrow tube as well, but the other 3 seemed to be sensitive to the change. So one of the questions that would be great to answer that we can't answer, but with an eye to the future, did crows approach the apparatuses and judge well? Did they imagine that the magnitude of the difference in the narrow tube is going to be so much more than the one in the wide tube, and that's how they were solving this task? Or were they using the visual feedback? So the food, you can see when the stone is dropped in or the object is dropped in, you're seeing the water rise and you can see the food floating, and so that incremental feedback of it coming closer to your face could be in and of itself rewarding so much that they would continue to use that option, or maybe it's the obvious option because in the narrow, when the narrow one is more functional, that's coming much closer to their face than the wide one, so maybe they're using that as a cue. So we can't tease that apart yet, but there's a potential that they could be using some kind of causal cognition to solve this, but further experiments will be able to tease that apart. So overall, how are birds learning to solve and solving foraging problems? Well, in the social learning experiment, we found that the crows, at least, are using stimulus enhancement to cue into what to attend to, and then they're solving the problems on their own. And when they're solving the problems on their own, how are they doing that? Well, they do seem to be pretty flexible about it in terms of being able to switch preferences according to the functional changes in the experiments we're giving them. And in this case, the Grackles are pretty flexible as well. And in the case of the jays, they weren't flexibly switching in this case, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So first I want to cover whether we're using good indicators of complex cognition, because behavioral flexibility and brain size there's a lot of literature out there that suggests that there is a link between these two factors in complex cognition. So in terms of what I was finding in the comparative part of the study is that innovation does appear to indicate cognitive ability, because at least with the crows and the grackles that are the innovative species, they were able to solve this novel problem using their problem-solving skills, and they seem to generalize to this new situation. But it kind of starts to break down in terms of the brain size, because the grackles have this smaller brain. And so the brain size is not quite clear what cognitive abilities you would predict according to what size brain, and where is there a threshold? Do all brain sizes have some complex cognitive capabilities? What is the relationship there? It's still not quite clear, especially since the scrub jays have an enlarged brain for their body size, but they are not innovative in the sense of the different foraging options that they don't have as a broad of a foraging palette as the grackles and the crows. And so with them, it seems like there must be multiple pathways to complex cognition. We shouldn't just rely on one indicator, such as innovations, as predicting where we might find complex cognition, because the western scrub jays, if you look at their behavioral flexibility in a caching context where they're storing food, they're extremely behaviorally flexible and have, there's some extensive evidence that they do have complex cognition. For instance, they seem to have episodic-like memory, so they can remember the what, where, and when of a particular cache that they made, and go back to that cache before it decays, and attend to the kind of properties that we look at in episodic memory in humans. They can plan for their future breakfast. What do they want to eat tomorrow morning? They can plan the night before to make the food appear in particular rooms that they want to eat in the next morning. They seem to have some kind of mental state attribution. So those birds who have stolen from another's cache in the past will rehide their caches if another sees them cache. So they seem to be taking into account what others can see and what they might do in the future as well. So all of these are excellent examples of western scrub jay complex cognition. So the fact that they weren't able to solve our kind of more general problem of this novel water tube task doesn't necessarily indicate that they don't have complex cognition. It just means that we're not looking at the right indicator in their case. So in terms of behavioral flexibility, I'm suggesting that we use multiple indicators when we're starting to look at what species should have complex cognition. And in this case of the scrub jays, their particular niche, the way that they need to store food to survive, that is an excellent system. So looking at other food storing animals could be a way of looking at whether complex cognition exists there as well. Brain size, as I've been mentioning, is not completely clear to me how we should map that onto complex cognition. But I think that there are some exciting studies happening now, especially in insects and other really, in terms of absolute brain size, very small-brained species. In terms of relative brain size, when you compare insect sister taxa to each other, there's some exciting things happening there in terms of brain size does seem to make a difference in terms of what cognitive abilities they have. But that's on a much smaller comparative scale than going across birds and mammals and such. So that is what I wanted to share with you today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a question and then a thought. And the question is, just to be clear, that measure of foraging innovation is basically saying, here are the number, if you went to the library and looked at all the books of ornithological journals and said, here's a note published about something different that species has done.
Exactly.
And then regress that against the number of total studies that came out in a database on that species. So we know that jungle fowl are really socially smart, and they do have a small brain, but maybe there's just so many studies of chickens out there that they would come out as being not very interesting.
Exactly. So in this case, because it's corrected for research effort, there are about 2,000 papers on chickens. But where are they happening? In factory farms. So there's no chance of, well, hardly no chance of discovering an innovation in chickens unless you study them in the wild. So that's one of the reasons why the chickens are so low.
So I guess that, raises several questions. If you get a brain size sort of issue on species that are studied relatively similarly, and it seems the corvids might be good examples of that. That might be useful there, but overall, although that metric has a lot of correlations with innovation and introduction success and expansion and all those things. The thought is that if you go back to your path diagram, that what you said is I agree with completely, which is complex cognition is complex, and maybe there are brain correlates or other specific correlates of specific attributes of cognition. And if you then break this complex cognition down into ability to do this or ability to do that or ability to be social or Machiavellian or whatever, you're going to find that different factors, are associated with those differentially.
Yeah, I think that is key to identifying some basic abilities that you would expect to have. So not just a particular kind of behavioral flexibility, but some underlying properties for what's making this flexibility. And so I'm actually working on a paper with 2 philosophers of science on this. And I just read the first draft last night. It's pretty cool. And it's getting at all of that, but I haven't integrated it enough to really coherently talk about it yet.
Let's talk later about attributes.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So I have 2 kind of methodological questions. One is about the narrow tube versus the wide tube, and when they had the situation where you just give them the 4 rods.
Yes.
So if they are unable to assess the number of rods that are available to them, does it change their pattern of behavior?
So are they keeping into quantities? Is that what you're thinking?
Right. So if you have 4 rods and that's all there are to use.
Yeah.
They're obviously preferentially choosing the one that is going to be a success. But if you have a potentially unknown number of objects to be dropped into the tube, do you know whether they demonstrate the same patterns, or have you done that, or has anyone done that?
I haven't done that, and I haven't seen that happen in this particular case. So that could be easily manipulated just by changing the water levels. We can change the water level so that they have to drop in 1 object or 3 objects or even 4 objects to be able to get the food. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about? Or
if they didn't know if they had 4 or 4,000 possible objects to drop in.
So like you maybe hide the objects behind a thing and they've got to reach in and pull them out. Yeah, I know that hasn't been done yet. That would be interesting. And in that case, you'd expect them to only go for the narrow and not the wide tube at all. Whereas in this case, they're still dropping objects into both tubes usually. But because they still have usually like 2 objects left over to be able, after solving it in the narrow tube.
Okay. Can I ask one more methodological question?
Sure.
Okay. So in the very first one where you had orange pushing the door to one side by sitting on top.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting that sort of showed this video where he's using an atypical or a particularly marked way of moving the door, and then you concluded it by saying that overall the birds were demonstrating stimulus enhancement followed by trial and error learning, right?
Yeah.
But yet in that case, all of the other birds were copying this unconventional technique. I mean, not they copied, but they were using it. So I was curious whether and how that example fit into your overall findings, or whether there were other cases of using idiosyncratic techniques that maintained at least brief transmission chains.
So there were a couple of other cases of techniques that were used. So in the side hole, a couple of females would often use a stick to get the food out. And so that was another way that you could solve it. And so Will and I did looking at those subset of interactions to see if that was potentially a case of imitation. The issue was that the number of interactions were so small that we couldn't do much with them statistically. And the overall finding of the stimulus enhancement and lack of imitation overall was pretty striking. So he was not thinking that we would go with the and we didn't actually analyze the subset of those like blue hanging off the side and how many individuals copied them, mostly because of sample size. Yeah, and I guess the fact that they weren't always doing this, and because the sample size was so small for those particular interactions, suggests that they're not really using that method anyway. And the birds that did copy blue in hanging off the side like that were not actually successful in getting the food out. So they went back to their other methods after that. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions and comments, and they relate to things that she just asked. I think her first question had to do with one of my questions, which is, if you're given the choice of things to drop in the either the tube or in the tube, what is the cost of making a mistake? Why not just toss everything in?
Yeah.
Okay, that's part of it. So I think her question about if you had 4,000, I mean, again, what is the cost of making a mistake of throwing the white ones in? What the heck? And her other point, this was one of my first feelings as well, related to that. I get the feeling that these birds just like to mess around with things. And so I think your initial tests of the swinging door and the hole in the side, you don't need to watch anybody else do that. That's easy to figure out. They just go over and mess with the door, it's gonna swing. I think if you gave them a more difficult problem, they might actually pay more attention to what someone else was doing. Because I think the level of difficulty was so easy that, yeah, this guy's got something to play with, fly over and mess with it yourself. They just like to do that, and that has to do with the individual variation in some of these tests. They want to play with the magnets. Maybe they're not so interested in the food that's in the tube. They just want to play with the stuff.
So your second question first, and then I'll have to ask you about the first question again because I'm not able to hold more than two things in my head at once. So yeah, actually with the social learning apparatus, the vertical flap was actually pretty difficult for them. And in the group, the control group, where there was no trained demonstrator, it took them until their, I think, fourth session of 45 minutes with the apparatus before they even attempted it.
Are they afraid of this
No.
any way? These
No.
wild caught birds take right to captivity? Okay.
Not all, but when you Caledonian crows and great-tailed grackles are really easy to habituate to anything. So in this case, they weren't afraid of it, except for the flap. The flap, because it was so difficult and it would fall on their heads, only the really bold birds would do that. So with social learning apparatus, the side hole, everyone could do that. They all went for it. I mean, that was really easy. The flap, only a few birds ever got, and then the vertical where you slide it to one side or another was difficult. So it seems like the presence of demonstrators actually facilitated the learning in that case. But you're right, they are very exploratory, and there are individual differences in, at least anecdotally, in how exploratory particular individuals are. And it's interesting to see the differences between the crows and the grackles, because the crows, I think, are a bit more persistent, and I think that helps them solve problems faster. And just because they're kind of learning more about the world and they're finding out what works kind of accidentally, and then they'll keep going once they've found the solution. Whereas the grackles might not be as persistent from the beginning, and so trying to get them to interact just so they can learn which option is going to be the right one is a little more difficult. So yeah, I'm seeing some differences there. And now I'm trying to remember your first question.
Cost of throwing everything in.
Right.
Why? So you humans consider that a mistake, but why?
Right, no, it's true. And they're in aviaries where the grackles have unlimited amounts of food. And so why participate? With the crows, the difference in terms of the wide versus narrow and the 12 objects that were given to them previously, and they didn't have a cost to dropping into either tube, so they just went for it, right? When we did introduce a cost, so now they can only be successful if they choose a narrow tube, they were sensitive to that. And I think that...
But that was only 4 out of 6, and that's not a big... I had some, with the sample sizes and the broad interpretations being drawn from them. There was only 6 birds. And
there are only 6 birds.
2.
And it's taken me 3 years to get that data from the grackles and months for the crows.
What was done with these animals. But
So we're doing what we can with what we have, and I mean, other comparative cognitive studies usually use the same sample sizes as well. Yeah.
So I want to address your conjecture regarding the vertical transmission that accounts for the differential distribution of the tool types.
Okay.
So if that conjecture is correct, then presumably you would expect some correlation with lineage success, right? So that, I mean, it's impossible to tell from the geographical distribution whether that correlates with lineage success. Presumably if population density isn't too variable across the island, it does. And then a related question is, if it's the case that the more successful lineages end up populating the culture space because there's vertical transmission, then, and it doesn't have to be true, that is, this prediction doesn't have to be true in order for your thesis to be correct, but if it is true, then your thesis is clearly correct, which is that maybe one of the things contributing to the lineage success is the greater efficacy of the tool type. Right? So if all the transmission is vertical, then if you happen to just through whatever random processes lead to different tool types, your lineage happens to hit on a more efficacious tool type, then eventually, let the system run long enough, you dominate the island. Right? So there's an empirical question whether equally skilled birds using different tool types have equal success rate, or whether some types actually work better than others, and whether that then correlates with the lineage success across the island.
Yeah, so one of the issues that Russell Gray's group has been having when they go to the field is trying to catch Pandanus tool users, and tool users that not only make these tools, but make different kinds of the tools. And they've been having a hard time. So when I was there were about 14 birds in the aviaries. And we put Pandanus plants in to see if they would start making tools. And I guess, so they were making narrow tools, but they were apparently really poorly constructed. So it looked like these birds didn't know how to make the tools fully yet. So I think that's kind of been one of the major factors of not exploring more how, especially like you're saying, the different lineages, because they do collect blood so they can get the genetic data from the individuals they're testing. Yeah, I think that is an excellent way forward, and it's one of the clearer ones.
Yeah, you might have sampling problems too, because it could be the case that you only really get good at tool use after considerable experience.
Yeah.
And experienced birds don't get trapped because they're savvy, right? So you're basically you're only catching novices.
Yeah, and that could very well be. Yeah.
A follow-up question on that, at a more proximate rather than ultimate level, is in terms of the development, your hypothetical account reminds me of the way bird song is thought to be learned, where the young hears the song of adult males, they form a template, and then they practice the template match as they emerge to adulthood.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there would be something with borrowing from that model to try and explore this. If you give, for example, wild-caught birds that aren't very good yet at tool use, give some in one group one type of tool, another group another type of tool. Over time, do they look like as they're practicing on making their own tools, do they converge on the template that they were given? The template matching kind of approach.
Yeah, that's another experiment we were discussing when I was out there, and also frustrated that these birds in particular weren't making the tools very well. But yeah, it's kind of like a cross-fostering experiment with different tool types and whether they can manufacture them. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think, in their pipeline in terms of future studies. But it'll depend on what kind of birds they can catch. But luckily, actually, Russell Gray just got appointed director of a Max Planck Institute. So there's money out there to now keep going with the field site for quite a long time. Yeah.
Which one?
It's in Jena. It's language. He's definitely the language director, but I'm trying to remember the overall name of it might even be human language. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit more about brain size and innovation. You'd think that it'd be worthwhile to have a bigger brain so you can innovate. if the food sources are variable, there's reason to be innovative. In a static environment, you'd think that you wouldn't really need to be very innovative.
Right.
And I don't know if anybody has tested that. I can just imagine one way, using species where there are subpopulations that have been associated with humans for a long time. And humans might be frequently changing the way they store food.
The way the birds.
I'm remembering some gulls who got my sandwich just when I turned my back.
Yeah.
So, but if you had, populations where a subpopulation had been living with humans and getting food from them for a long time versus a wild population not associated with humans, you might expect the ones associated with humans to have evolved larger brains.
So there is a study on a sparrow. I don't remember details, but they compared urban versus forest populations of a species. I think it was in terms of their neophobia and I think there was a cognitive test in there as well. I'm not remembering the details, but I could look it up and show you. That's definitely something I considered with the Grackles. And the issue was I couldn't find any Grackles that were in non-urban environments. So they seem to have just completely, and the Grackles are one of the species where you turn your head and your quesadillas are gone. Zoo visitors, the Santa Barbara Zoo is one of the places I work with the Grackles, and the restaurants there have to replace so much food because the Grackles are stealing their French fries, their just hamburger buns, kind of like whatever. So it's definitely, it seems like a niche that you could exploit that potentially could create some differences.
But there's a confound there, which is that if humans provide a much denser patch, right, the resource availability is much higher, then you can actually get stupider because there's plenty of food. You don't have to solve hard problems. The people are dirty, right?
Well, until your bird population was big enough to have to compete for the food.
True.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of humans relative to the birds, right? That is, it may be an inexhaustible resource.
One thing I'm noticing is that the weight that I catch the Grackles at from the wild is the same. They maintain that weight even when they're in the aviary and they have unlimited amounts of food. So they seem to be at their max weight when they're in the wild. So they are getting, they're getting a lot of food. High fat. They eat a lot of French fries, a ton of French fries. So yeah, there might be some saturation there, like you're mentioning. Barney?
So just a couple of things. One is in response to this, is that we assume that they're responding to humans because we're doing all these things. But in fact, birds utilize other animals or other situations to get food, and they've learned how to do this. They don't have to steal from humans. They can steal from cattle. They do this all the time in the wild. So this is not something that they've evolved just for us. And so, but the point I was going to about brain size is, a confound that we've talked about, but I think it's really important to keep in mind. If you're a scrub jay and you're storing a lot of food, you have very powerful spatial memory capabilities, and you have a very large hippocampus, then that might account for a great deal of the brain size capacity. Yeah. If you're a songbird, a passerine bird that has an Osing passerine bird that has a lot of your brain space devoted to a song system, and you have a large hippocampus, then you may have less brain space that's available if you're just looking at overall brain size that could be devoted to innovation. And so this overall brain size really needs to consider all the various capabilities that the bird shows, and frankly, the kinds of studies that could identify looking at immediate early gene expression or putting in some kind of imaging to be able to measure, to see what part of the brain is actually involved when they're doing something innovative like this is really crucial.
And that's why Barney and I are collaborating with Nicole on doing an analysis of great-tailed grackles so we can compare their neuroanatomy, so the volume of different brain regions and the neuron density of different brain regions with the crows and other species of birds that have been tested so far. So we can see what are there particular enlargements that we would expect that you, in particular brains areas that you would need to solve these kinds of foraging problems.
Presumably the costs of total increase in brain size are higher in birds than they are in other animals because you got to fly, right?
Yeah.
So brains are always expensive, but if you got to carry them up in the air, and then they get even more expensive.
I have a question about the leaf evidence. And so you said that a lot of the evidence, because they're so difficult to study, these birds in the habitat, a lot of the evidence came from the patterns left in the leaves.
Yeah.
So that presumes that those tools are not modified after they're taken off from the leaf. And
Right.
so I wondered, well, how do you know that's true, A, but B, have you guys tried messing around with Pandanus leaves with something like a bird bill and see how it cuts that, and it may just be a particular leaf and a bill makes a cut like this no matter what you do to it. I mean, so have you guys A, messed around with tools and those leaves to see what kind of patterns can be produced based on the leaf anatomy? And how much evidence do you have that they're not modifying wide tools into stepped tools later?
So the leaf morphology doesn't change across the range of the island. So there isn't a reason to expect that particular leaves in particular areas would be producing different kinds of tools, different shapes. And to make the step tools, they actually have to make an additional cut on the plant. And that, yeah, and that's how they can also see what type of tool was made on the plant. And that, so it seems to be...
They can't take a wide tool, hold it under their feet, and make a step tool from it?
I have not seen that reported in the literature anywhere from the people who have seen them making those tools. So it seems to just be happening on the plant. Yeah. Clark.
Yeah, I was wondering about the new Caledonian crows. You said some things that made it sound like they might be doing teaching, the adults. So, but I didn't know if that's what, no chance.
It was me
Because
using sloppy language at first and trying to correct it after I'd already said it.
All right.
No,
Because
no,
you said, for example, that they left the tools in the holes.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there was any evidence or speculation that they're doing that for a reason.
So they do seem to leave tools in holes to like save it for later for themselves, and I think that's why the tools are in the holes, and not because. And there is evidence that they go around and steal each other's tools that are stuck in the holes, as well. So I think that's more what's happening, and I don't think teaching is involved. Because and actually there is evidence for that. So Jenny Holzheider and the Auckland group did a study on tool use in the wild, and in the juveniles they, what was it? The adults did not change anything about their behavior in the presence of juveniles or absence of juveniles. And so it was really just an opportunity. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, watching the bird play with the magnets very much as a human might, I think, in the same situation.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you deprived these birds of food for some period before the trials, as is commonly done in like rodent cognition testing.
Yeah, so with the Grackles, they're allowed to be, so I'm allowed to take out their food from their cages for 4 hours per day. And so depending on when I did the test with a particular bird, it might be immediately after I removed their food, or it might be at the end of the 4-hour period. With the crows, they were deprived in the morning. Their regular food was taken away, and then they were tested. They were given lunch, and then they were tested again in the afternoon, and then fed dinner. So the deprivation patterns kind of vary a little bit. One of the things I did notice with the Grackles is that they don't always care about the food, kind of like what you were saying. Sometimes they just seem to be participating because it seems interesting to them, and what else do they have to do? They're sitting in the aviary. So it's interesting. They'll get the food out, but then they'll just kind of walk away and wait for me to rebait. So there are definitely species differences in terms of how much they're attending to the food. And like the crows would just stuff meat in their face until they couldn't anymore. But the Grackles, I think they have a different foraging pattern, and so they kind of get food throughout the day, and they don't seem to have this kind of scarcity issue.
Another question?
Yeah.
So I was intrigued that you said, I think it was for the Grackles, but maybe the other words, you mentioned that they did like several hundred trials on a tube that wasn't the water tube before they do. And then I guess my question would be, if you're studying novel problem solving, but you've already trained them to do one problem, I mean, how novel is the problem that they're facing? Is that an issue, and how do you sort of think about it?
So it's novel in the sense that they had to transfer to the water tube situation.
Yeah.
So they were trained on how to drop stones down a platform apparatus. And now they've got a different mechanism happening. So instead of dropping a stone down and this platform collapses and you get food out of the front, you drop a stone in, it raises the water level, and you have to get the food out here.
Yeah.
So something different is happening. And what we're really asking questions about is the differences in the objects and the differences in the tubes. So the functional properties of those rather than necessarily.
But presumably something like, so the heavier stones are going to be better at first pass than light stones too, I think.
So I tend to use stones that displace about the same amount of water. So there
No, but
would.
you said there's some sort of lever that dispenses food, so if I drop a piece of styrofoam on that, it's not.
Right. Sorry, I should have mentioned. So when we're training them, we only give them stones. They don't have different objects at all. They only get stones, and they get stones that are about the same weight as each other.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're really only experienced with these novel objects, the heavy versus light, or objects to drop down the wide versus narrow tubes, is just before they start their test.
But in a skeptical mode, then, isn't one possibility that they're used to the heavier stones because that's what they were trained on, and that's why they show the preference in the second task?
Yep, which is why I did the follow-up experiment with is it actually flexible? Like, are they actually paying attention here, or are they just going with what seems more familiar?
Okay.
And the fact that they were able to switch to a degree, the Grackles and the crows in the wide versus narrow, that seems to indicate it's not just some kind of bias.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Do you think if you did the social learning experiment with juveniles, potentially copying adults, there might be more of an effect beyond simply stimulus enhancement?
No, because juveniles and adults were in all of the groups. Well, so there was a group completely made up of adults. There was a group, it was actually a family group, 2 parents and their 2 sons. And then there was a group that had 1 adult female and then 5 juveniles of both sexes. And what we saw was that the juveniles are much more likely to approach the apparatus in the first place because they seem more neophilic and more exploratory. Like in the family group, the sons were on the table trying to solve it, and the parents were kind of watching, and then they would come in and solve it afterward, after they'd seen what their sons had done. One of the sons, though, was he was in the non-demonstrator group. Nope, they were just finding out on their own. In the group of the white oranges group, she was actually a juvenile. She was the trained demonstrator. And the adult in that group learned how to do the vertical flap through watching the demonstrator. So it seemed like the adults, we have evidence that the adults were learning as much as the juveniles were, and from everyone. So there didn't seem to be that kind of vertical transmission restriction. And it seems like, sure, this is a lab setting, where we're putting kind of these artificial groups together in some cases. And so if they had the opportunity in the wild, they would probably use information from anyone. It's just that they're mostly exposed just to their family. Other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all.